On Saphix, the enemy resorted to orbital bombardment. There was nothing left of the surface now, just an endless wasteland riven with craters and chasms. But underground, humanity endured. Saphix had been one of the last planets settled by the United Republic of Earth before first contact with the Kelk. Humans had come across several alien species in their explorations of the galaxy, but up until that point, all of them had been relatively peaceful and relatively friendly. The Kelk were neither peaceful nor friendly. The war hadn't begun immediately, though, and for a while Saphix had prospered. Then the Kelk had concluded their war with the Tresorians and turned their attention to the human colonies nearest their space. They were highly territorial, highly aggressive. They conquered for resources, but they also conquered simply because they couldn't tolerate any other intelligent species near them. They had, by the standards of both humans and the rest of the galaxy, a hyper-awareness for potential threats. In other words, they were extremely paranoid. They only felt safe if they exercised total control over everything anywhere near their worlds, and they had the military force to back this up. The Kelk had demanded that the URE cede them 27 colonies near their borders, close to 1 billion people. Earth didn't even have the ships to evacuate them all within the deadline, let alone find housing for all the refugees. Everyone knew the Kelk were stronger than the URE, but there was no choice. Humanity had to fight for what was theirs. The war went badly at first, very badly. Even though the Kelk weren't much more technologically advanced, their fleets were a lot larger. So many ships were lost in the early engagements that the remains of humanity's military strength had to pull back to the most heavily defended planets, leaving many of the most remote colonies to fend more or less for themselves. Some colonies had surrendered, not that it did them much good. Saphix had fought. When the Kelk landing ships came screaming down through the upper atmosphere, they were met with jury-rigged anti-air defenses that had been adapted from the lasers meant to break up incoming asteroids. When the survivors of the assault force made it to the ground, they were bombarded with explosives carried by delivery drones. And when they advanced, they were checked by soldiers armed with 3D-printed weapons and tanks converted from farming equipment. The colonists on Saphix died by the thousands, of course, but they took many of the enemy with them. The campaign to defend their home degenerated into trench warfare with a modern twist. Covered trenches to protect from air and orbital strikes, with only heavily armored bunkers protruding from the surface. Armies dug in across the entire planet in fortification networks that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The Kelk had the training and equipment, but the colonists had a huge advantage in numbers. In the beginning, the Kelk wanted to capture as much of the planet's infrastructure intact as possible to use as a springboard for further attacks deeper into human space. But even while their cities were still intact, the colonists started digging bunkers deep beneath them for the civilian population to take refuge in as a precaution. This was a wise choice. After months without progress, the Kelk resorted to bombing the cities to take out factories and transport hubs supplying the war effort. At first, they were careful to be fairly accurate, but as the resistance ground on and on, they increasingly stopped caring about how much damage their strikes did. It was more important for them to deny infrastructure to their enemy than to capture it for their own use. Kelk psychology in a nutshell. And still, Saphix stood firm. The colonists weren't entirely cut off from the rest of the human worlds. Occasional supply conveys did get through, carrying weapons and essentials like food and medicine. As the battles chewed up the landscape, it became increasingly difficult for them to grow their own food. But the convoys from Earth kept them going long enough to establish hydroponic farms in the bunkers and tunnels they were still expanding beneath the ruins of their cities. Finally, after almost a decade of war, the Kelk lost patience. The colonists knew the orbital bombardment was coming because the Kelk withdrew their ground forces, ceding land they had fought over for years. It was the moment the colonists had feared since the day the Kelk ships first appeared in their skies. They wept as they descended from the surface for the last time. They knew that they would never see trees and blue skies again, at least not within their lifetime. Then they sat in silence, as the ground around them shook and trembled under the rage and hatred of the Kelk. The kinetic missiles blanketed most of the main continent and did serious damage to the other major land masses. By the time they finally stopped, the ground was riven with gaping wounds and the skies were choked with dust. Brown rain fell on a lifeless desert that would not see the sun again for decades. When the Kelk landed after the bombardment, they did so in the expectation that they would be able to establish a forward operating base and move on to the next planet. Instead, they were attacked, and the unprepared landing teams were slaughtered. The vehicles and the flyers that carried out the raid quickly retreated into underground bases before the Kelk fleet in orbit could retaliate. It was at this point that they realized they'd made a mistake. Two mistakes, actually. The second most serious was that they'd just blanketed Saphix in a layer of dust that their sensors couldn't penetrate. The most serious mistake was that they'd catastrophically underestimated the human will to fight. The Kelk assessments before the war had concluded that humans weren't well armed, nor did they display a particularly warlike nature. It should have been easy to carve out a buffer zone they could cede with their own colonies and reduce the URE's territory to a size they could easily dominate. It was what they had done with a dozen similar species across the last few millennia. The war on Saphix should have lasted weeks at most. Even the worst-case scenarios wargamed by the invasion planners had predicted that it would be physically impossible for the humans to hold out for more than a couple of months. Yet after 10 years, not only was the conquest not over, the colonists were a greater threat now than they had been at the beginning, and they could ill afford the resources Saphix was consuming. The war was still raging across the rest of the border colonies. Some had fallen, but like Saphix, many were still resisting, and the rest of the URE was still fighting hard to support them. But the Kelk were the Kelk, and so long as the humans resisted, they weren't capable of backing down. They had to eliminate the threat, no matter what it took. So they re-landed their armies, and the war for the underground began. Tunnel by tunnel, bunker by bunker. The Kelk attacked, and sometimes they were driven back, and sometimes they broke through. But no matter what, they took horrendous casualties. The colonists had had years to prepare the defenses of their underground refugees. The Kelk tried everything: flooding, gas, firestorms to suck out the oxygen. Nothing worked. Every stratagem they could devise had already been foreseen and forestalled during the tunnel's design phase. The Labyrinth of Saphix became famous across the galaxy. To the exhausted URE, it was a beacon of hope and symbol of what they were fighting for and the example they fought by. Every classroom had a diagram of Saphix and its underground fortresses on the wall. To the Kelk, it was a nightmare that haunted their dreams. From the elders of the Great Assembly down to the smallest child, every one of them felt its baleful presence, lurking just beyond the horizon. They could not retreat and just leave it there, looming on their borders. But every one of them was terrified of the day he or she would be sent there to be fed into the endless meat grinder. As units were rotate in and out, a significant portion of the entire Kelk military ended up fighting there. Every Kelk soldier had a horror story from their time there. Fighting for 2 days to take a bunker only for it to be collapsed by pre-planted charges, burying half the unit. Being driven back by a counterattack, running through ever narrower tunnels, trying to stay ahead of the enemy as the walls closed in and the air got thinner and thinner. Clearing a section only to be ambushed by a suicide platoon of humans that had been sealed inside the walls for over a month. By the 15th year of the war, many of the humans fighting for their home hadn't even been born when the Kelk arrived. They had been trained to hold a weapon from the moment they could walk, put in support units when they were 12 or 13, and if they survived a year of that, They were formed into frontline units. Frontline units that were rotated out of the line more frequently, but they still fought and they still died. The colonists on Saphix had long since stopped trying to spare their children from the horrors of war. Death would come for them whether they were armed or not. The only sure way to get their children killed was to leave them unprepared to face the Kelk. And nothing could make a real soldier other than genuine combat experience. They did what they had to do, both for their children and the war effort in general. The war on Saphix was literally creating new threats faster than the Kelk could kill them. The younger the human was, the better their reflexes and the less they hesitated. That was what the veterans Kelk on Saphix learned. Many Kelk soldiers with over a century of combat experience were hacked to death by a 14-year-old with a pickaxe they'd just used to break through a secret tunnel. The younger humans coped better in the tunnels as well. They could get around more fluidly, and they knew how to move so the sound didn't carry through the rock. The Kelk thought the humans might have started genetically engineering their offspring. That would account for why they seemed to be so much more lethal. It never occurred to them that unlike their parents, who had grown up with no adrenaline rush more intense than a bungee jump, the younger humans were better adapted because they had never known anything else. 15 years was a short time to the Kelk, but it was an entire lifetime for many of the soldiers they were fighting. Although even if it wasn't a long time for the Kelk, it could certainly feel like it. Every month in the tunnels seemed to last for centuries. Even with their large advantage in resources, the battles on Saphix were bleeding the Kelk white. They had used their trump card years ago, and the orbital bombardment had only made things worse. Slowly, the realization began to dawn on the Kelk military leadership that they couldn't win. The problem was that the elders, none of whom had fought since the successful wars against the Makarites and the Hazan, would not countenance retreat. The Great Assembly demanded that the assault on Saphix continue until all threats there were eliminated. The Kelk generals tried to explain that they were losing the war. The campaign on Saphix was too costly given how strong resistance was on other fronts. Not only could they not force the humans out of the border colonies, they were very likely to start pushing back in the next few years, and when that happened, the Kelk military would not be able to stop them from pushing into Kelk space. Yet still, their elders refused to hear their words. All threats had to be destroyed. There could be no let up while there was even the slightest danger from humans. The fact that they faced the prospect of a human incursion into Kelk space was simply more reason to redouble their efforts and destroy the humans once and for all. The war ground on. It was coming up to its 20th anniversary, and the military's predictions about course of the war had all been fulfilled. The humans were steadily pushing back the Kelk forces and had started launching attacks on Kelk worlds near the border zone. And the Labyrinth of Saphix still stood. Mostly on the bones of the fallen at this point, ran the saying in the Kelk military. Even millennia after they figured out their planet was a sphere, their culture had never let go of the flat world trope. To the Kelk, whatever world they were on was merely a thin layer sandwiched between different realms of the dead. Saphix was quite literally hell for them. Finally, one general approached the elders without the usual layers of ritual and deference. He was a recent promotion, and he'd fought several tours on Saphix, including one where he'd watched his wife's head shot off by a teenage girl armed with a plasma rifle older than she was. And he said plainly to them, with the directness only someone who's had to scrape his wife's brains off his uniform can achieve, "Our old methods do not work on humans. We have fought them for 20 years. We have sacrificed tens of millions of lives. And we are still no closer to neutralizing them. In fact, they are more of a danger today than they were 20 years ago, while we continue to suffer losses we can't replace quickly enough. We attacked them because they could pose a threat to us, and we wanted to remove that possible threat. But the more we fight them, the worse of a threat they are. At this point, the best we can do is minimize the threat, and the only way to do that is to make peace with the humans. Some of the elders actually seemed to be giving these words some thought, but many were still unable to accept the idea of leaving a world near their borders outside their control. How would we ever sleep at night, they asked, knowing that Saphix was still there, untamed? To which the general said, well, you can either learn to live with that or you can die with it, because if this war continues the way it is, the humans are going to kill us all. Then he walked out. That wasn't the end of the debate, but it was the beginning of peace. When the fighting ended, the Labyrinth of Saphix stood firm, and the people, like their planet, were scarred but still endured.